Hello, Brookings Biology students. This is Mrs. Vanderwall. Today we're going to be learning about Chapter 8, Section 3, the reactions of photosynthesis. Remember back in biology when we were learning all the parts of the cells for plants and animals? And we told you that photosynthesis takes place within the chloroplast. Well, the enzymes today we're going to find out also take place for photosynthesis within the chloroplast. And now I'll take you to a video. It's better to show it to you this way so that everyone can see it bigger. In this chapter, it's important to really pay attention to these parts of the video because I think it makes it easier to remember the steps of photosynthesis.
Plants convert light energy into a form usable by cells. This process is called photosynthesis. Leaves are the primary light-collecting organs of plants. The cells in leaves contain specialized organelles called chloroplasts. Photosynthesis occurs within the chloroplast. Each chloroplast consists of two membranes, the outer membrane and the inner membrane. Fused layers of inner membrane form disc-shaped structures called thylakoids. A stack of thylakoids is called a granum. The grana are surrounded by a gel-like matrix called the stroma. Thylakoids convert light energy into the chemical energy of ATP. Each thylakoid is a closed compartment. The space within is called the thylakoid space, or lumen.
Okay, the parts that we need to know from that video is that the stack of all these thylakoids stacked up is called a granum. And if we're, like we saw in the video, there was multiple stacks of granum, then we call them grana, plural form for many stacks. The thylakoid reminds me more of let's say a Girl Scout chocolate mint cookie. And if we stacked one cookie on top of each other, just this part right here would be one cookie alone. And it has an inside sac as well. But the thylakoid is a sac-like photosynthetic membrane inside the chloroplast. And actually in the surface of the thylakoid is where photosynthesis takes place. Now if we're talking about a Girl Scout chocolate cookie, the inside part where the mint is, it would be the part where it would be the thylakoid space. It's the gel-filled space inside the thylakoid sac. And we're going to find out that this is where hydrogen accumulates. Over here, on this part, is called the stroma. It's a gel-filled space as well, inside the chloroplast surrounding the thylakoid sac. And that's where the light-independent, or Calvin cycle, is located. And we're going to learn more about that in Part 2. This is a cytoplasm. We find this gel-filled space outside the chloroplast, but it is inside the cell membrane. Photosynthesis happens in the chloroplast, and you can see in this diagram that it has an outer membrane and an inner membrane. And the proteins that are part of the thylakoid membrane organize light-absorbing pigments into clusters called photosystems. Just like we need stored energy of adenosine triphosphate, so does a plant. So living things need energy carriers, and ATP is an energy carrier. This is adenosine here, triphosphate. This is the adenosine part, and we have 3 phosphates. It's also known as ATP. And we also have a molecule that carries high energy electrons called NADP+, all capital letters with a plus sign that's a superscript. And on your note-taking guides, the screen didn't really run off very well, so if you can't read yours because yours is pretty dark, make sure to darken it in so that you can read that it's NADP+, or draw an arrow. High-energy electron carriers require a special carrier too. NADP+ is one of the carriers that cells use to transport high-energy electrons. There are quite a few others, but your state standards don't require you to know the other names. So, NADP plus 2 electrons, remember electrons from chapter 1 are negatively charged, plus hydrogen ions produces NADPH. Now, NADP plus has a long name that it's represented. It really means it's nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide phosphate. And we're pretty wordy in biology, and Mrs. Rideout and I are okay for you to just put capital N, capital A, capital D, capital P with a plus to represent that long term. Now in photosynthesis, it's very important for you to remember that plants need light and they need to be watered. So if you've ever taken care of maybe somebody's yard while they're away and you have to water their grass or water their flower garden or their vegetable garden, or maybe you have to go inside and water their plants. A plant does need water to survive. Now it's important not to waterlog them. I've had, for example, poinsettias at Christmas that I've been given, and then I noticed that the container didn't have any holes so that the water wouldn't drain, and I waterlogged the plants and I killed it. My mom's 87 and she forgets. She has those glass balls that you can actually fill with water and invert and put into your flower pots, and she thinks if she does that once a week it's good enough, but her plants dry out and they don't look very well, and so she needs to water them a little bit more frequent than that. Light also is important. So if you're planting a fruit garden, or let's say a vegetable garden, vegetables like full sun, flower garden, for example, some plants like full sun and others like to be in the shade. So if your yard is in the full sun, gets daylight, gets that hot afternoon sun, then you want to plant marigolds or geraniums or petunias or snapdragons, because all those plants like full sun. There are plants that like shade as well, and I find that for example, my Gerber daisies do a little bit better if they're shaded than if they're in full sun, because they all turn nice and brown otherwise. If you have a plant called Nastilbe, it likes to be in the shade. So do hostas, and so do hydrangeas. So they need to be on your shadier side of your house. But anyway, in the light-dependent reaction, which most plants do, oxygen is given off in the daytime. And it also produces adenosine triphosphate and NADPH, which is a requirement and essential for the light-independent reaction, also known as Calvin cycle, to use. This is the chloroplast up here, and this whole green stack is called a granum. The individual part would be a thylakoid, and here we have a thylakoid membrane, and this tells us that this whole area here is the inside and this area down here is the outside. It has a phospholipid bilayer, and just like the other phospholipids we learned in cell membranes, the polar head likes water, but the tails do not. And again, we have tails and we have polar head. These green and blue blobs that we have here are actually proteins. And this one's got a special name. It's called photosystem 2. And then this little arrow in here is reminding us that sunlight energy of photons comes in a photosystem 2. And when it does, it splits water apart, and electrons here, looks like almost like a roller coaster. This is called electron transfer chain between these three proteins and this fourth one over here. And this electron transport system, also known as electron transport chain, connects photosystem 2 to photosystem 1. When the electrons go down, and especially like right here in the second one, there are usually some hydrogen that are in the stroma, and they are able to go across and gather in the thylakoid space. Electrons continue, and over here in photosystem 1, with the help of the hydrogen and electrons, and NADP plus becomes NADPH. Over here, this red-orange blob is really called ATP synthase, and it spins like a top or a revolving door. If you've ever gone to a fancy hotel in a big city, a lot of times they have, looks elegant, a revolving door, but it also has a purpose in that most of the time they can reduce how much dust comes in and debris comes through the door. So it does have its purpose. Just like if you've ever been down to USD, to the football stadium, they have an inflatable ceiling and they need to keep pressure on this ceiling. So you come through revolving doors so they don't lose all the pressure and the ceiling stays inflated. Well, you might think it's kind of weird that photosystem 2 is listed before photosystem 1. And actually photosystem 1 was discovered first, but photosystem 2 happens first. And I don't rightly know why we don't rename it, but I think it probably has to do with all of the research that had been done had already been printed, and it would be pretty costly to go back and change everything. So all we have to do in this chapter is remember that photosystem 2 happens first, but was discovered after photosystem 1. I'll take you to this other video. Now this one has lots of steps to it, and I encourage you on this video to come back to it and watch it again, because it's very important that you know all these steps to do well on this chapter test. And it's okay just to watch something over and over until you get it. So here we have it.
Groups of light-collecting molecules called photosystem 2 and photosystem 1 are embedded within the thylakoid membrane. Proteins called electron carriers serve as messengers between these photosystems. An additional protein, ATP synthase, produces ATP. Light striking photosystem 2 is absorbed, and its energy is used to split water into one atom of oxygen, 2 hydrogen ions, and 2 electrons. The hydrogen ions stay in the thylakoid space, while the electrons move into photosystem 2. Light energizes the electrons. They are then accepted by the first protein in a series of electron carriers. This protein carries them to the second carrier. Energy from the electrons is used to pump hydrogen ions across the thylakoid membrane. As a result, the concentration of hydrogen ions in the thylakoid space increases. The electrons are accepted by the third electron carrier. This carrier delivers them to photosystem 1. Light energizes the electrons again. The energized electrons move to the final carrier protein, which adds them to NADP+ to form NADPH. Recall that concentration of hydrogen ions is greater inside the thylakoid space than outside in the stroma. Therefore, hydrogen ions readily diffuse out of the thylakoid. The protein ATP synthase uses the energy released by this flow to convert ADP to ATP by the addition of a phosphate. The chemical energy stored in ATP can then be used by the cell to power cell functions.
Again, I encourage you to go back and to review that so that you know it. There are so many steps involved. We wanted to go back and remind ourselves from cell biology that molecules do move from where there's a lot to where there's not so many. When diffusion happens anytime there is a difference in concentration one place compared to another, it's called a concentration gradient. In the video they showed you that hydrogen does this. It accumulates within the thylakoid, and since there's so many, then it wants to come out of the thylakoid. Diffusion can happen across membranes too, and there's also some water movement and some other things. So here we have a very detailed diagram of it, and we can get our bearings by looking at the ATP synthase, and the ball part of the ATP synthase is always in the stroma. And so this has to be the inside of the thylakoid, and down here is the outside of the thylakoid. And so here tells us that this is the thylakoid membrane, and this D tells us that this is the stroma out here, and this is the inner thylakoid space. So you got the lightning bolt of sunlight coming in, which is photons, and it excites the photosystem 2 into splitting water apart. So we have hydrogen that accumulates inside the thylakoid space, and we have the electrons from that split going through the electron transport chain, or also known as electron transport system. When it hits the second protein here, it's able to actually grab some of the hydrogen that it also have accumulated in the stroma to bring it into the thylakoid space. When it gets to photosystem 1, this is where nicotinamide adenosine dinucleotide phosphate connects with hydrogen and electrons to form NADPH. And this is something that's necessary for the light independent reaction, also known as the Calvin cycle, to use. When you have hydrogen, the hydrogen are going to accumulate, but they're going to come through the spinning top of ATP synthase. And when they do that, ADP, adenosine diphosphate, is going to connect with another phosphate with hydrogen, and that forms ATP. And this adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, is also needed for the light-independent reaction. So I'm going to show you that the ATP synthase spins. I'm going to take you to this action, and we'll see if we get this to work. Sometimes it shows up behind, and I don't see it, so I'm going to have to hit it again. Try it again. Oops, I'll move this. There it is. Okay, so here we have the thylakoid membrane. Here's the polar heads, nonpolar tails, nonpolar tail, polar head. This would be the ball part of that ATP synthase, and there's some other words here, but you don't need to really be concerned about that. You're going to notice that hydrogen is going to go through this, and on this side over here, ATP synthase is going to connect ADP plus P to form ATP. So let's play it. It's got a noise to it, so don't let that bother you. So hydrogen's going through. When it does, it becomes the bond that connects the ADP plus the phosphate to form ATP. And you can rewind it and play it again. Now I'm going to take you to this one. And it's okay to open that one. Now you'll notice there's a few other things. There's a PQ, there's a PC, and an FD. And these are also electron carriers, but these are ones that their state requirements don't require you to know. But to have you know that we're kind of giving you most of the picture that you need to know, but there's actually a few steps that we're leaving out because that's what they want, their state system wants you to know. So here we have photosystem 2, and you're going to see this goes really quick. And so this really is one that I encourage you to come back to watch it again and again until you've got the steps. So photosystem 2 is where energy from the sun is going to come and excite the electrons, and it's going to split this water molecule apart. And when it does, you're going to watch electrons coming down through here and some hydrogen coming across. And over here in photosystem 2, you're going to see the NADP plus becoming NADPH. And then you'll watch the ATP synthase spinning, and you'll see on this side that ATP is going to be forming. So here we go. Sunlight comes in, water split apart, electrons go through electron transport chain, another electron is split. And you got NADPH, and over here we have ATP that is formed. I'm going to rewind that one more time. Again, watch it. You got water split apart from sunlight. You got electrons coming through the electron transport chain. You got more sunlight coming in. You got electrons that are going to connect NADP plus to form NADPH, and at the end we get ATP. And so again, I would really encourage you to come back, watch it a few times, and you're going to find that this chapter is a whole lot easier to understand. So the light-dependent reaction, just like if you're a dependent of your family, most likely, the responsibilities for taking care of you are upon your parent. This means that light-dependent light is required. So it requires light for this to take place. The molecules are part of the thylakoid membrane, and in that we saw from the diagrams, it's made up of photosystem 2. Remember, photosystem 2 happens first but was discovered after photosystem 1. They're connected by the electron transport chain, but it also has another name called the electron transport system. And there's the reddish-orange ATP synthase in our diagrams that's also included in the thylakoid membrane. It uses light energy to change adenosine diphosphate plus phosphate to form ATP, which is adenosine triphosphate. And nicotinamide adenosine dinucleotide phosphate plus 2 electrons plus hydrogen forms NADPH. Those are all capital letters for that. In the beginning, in photosystem 2, we saw that water breaks apart, and it's going to release oxygen when there's 2 molecules of oxygen into the air during the daytime. Again, for the light-dependent reaction, for plants to thrive, they need both light and water. One thing might help you on this is that one time I took a cake over to my mother on her birthday, and after we had a piece of cake, I offered to, I'll I'll get up and I'll take care of the dishes. And I went to her dishwasher and I opened her dishwasher, and lo and behold, there was a green plant in her dishwasher. And I wondered what, but I was kind of a little bit puzzled by it, and I didn't want to bother her with that, and I wasn't sure why the green plant would be in the dishwasher. But months later I did get around to asking her, you know, when it was your birthday and I put the dishes away, I had to put the dishes over a green plant that was in your dishwasher. Why was a green plant in your dishwasher? Oh, she said, oh. You see, the neighbors knew it was my birthday and they stopped, and I thought the plant looked kind of messy, so I opened the dishwasher and shoved it in. Well, I was kind of glad that was, and I was hoping that was the reason, because everybody's dishwasher that I've ever seen has never had a light source on the inside. And so plants would thrive better, would live better, would look greener if they have the light that they like and the amount of water that they prefer. A light-dependent reaction is going to give off oxygen in the daytime, and that's good for us because we breathe it. And the light-dependent reaction produces ATP, which is adenosine triphosphate, and NADPH, which these are both electron carriers that are necessary for the light-independent reaction to use. And we're going to include it with that today in part 1, and then in part 2 we'll get into the details of the Calvin cycle.